If you're new to our channel, we like to recap every episode of Critical Role, and that's what we are about to dive into here. But we cut out that recap from the podcast and host it separately on YouTube for your viewing convenience. So if you happen to find yourselves on that recap video and you would like to hear Blake and I's full thoughts on the episode, theories, and all that jazz, we will link to it in the description box below. But without further ado, Blake, if you want to start us off on this one, episode 45, Ominous Lectures.
Yeah, so episode 45, Ominous Lectures. The party, remember from the previous episode, they're in the warehouse interrogating Tuldus with Planesrider Rin, who has shown up and has essentially charmed this person to the extreme. And the party is thinking about their next steps. It seems like the next steps is going to be to move on to the Feywild and connect with old Nana Morrigan. Before they do that, there's a couple of loose ends. One notably, where is Ashton? Two, there is Professor Sumal, who did the study for going way back when for Liliana, Imogen's mom. And then we have FCG, who also wants to meet Vitro Asham to find out more about his origin story. So the party basically tells Rin, like, hey, let's table this just for a little bit and let's kind of go wrap all these loose ends up. So Rin's like, all right, well, just let me know. Imogen casts Sending to Ashton and basically is like, where the heck are you? What's going on? And realizes she doesn't have a spell slot to hear back from Ashton, but kind of just assumes like he would know kind of what we would be doing, right? Additionally, Ludinus decides to have Pate watch Tuldus, who's in the corner, and sort of keep watch to make sure that there's no funny business with Tuldus. The party heads over to the seminary, where they do meet up with Ashton, who has been absent for 2 episodes. Talison's been absent, and Talison begins to tell them a story of the utter shenanigans of what he had been doing for the previous 2 episodes, and basically tells a story of how he saw someone in the crowd named Violet, who was part either of his old crew or someone he had worked with in the past, and they connected eyes with sort of like this nonverbal message of like, hey, we should probably talk. From there, he realized that Violet was in a whole mess of things. He himself got wrapped into some shenanigans that involved mobsters, kidnapping, a massive fight in a kitchen, getting knocked out, waking back up, fighting in a kitchen again, including what he called the feds. Basically, it wasn't really clear if it was like a big sting operation or what. But all that to say, the officials of EOS are essentially grateful for, one less mobster off the streets. And as Ashton puts it, he makes a ton of money on this. But either I think when he gets knocked out, maybe he loses it or something. But all that to say, he says he has a lot of dough and he has quite a bit of baked goods that he's brought back with him. So, as well as an apron that he's still wearing. So they exchange some more notes. Ashton mentions that he did, in fact, hear about the Ruby Vanguard, and that the city is pretty much on edge, not just because of this Ruby Vanguard, this person from the Dwendalian Empire who's shown up, presumably Ludinus, but also the Judicators from Vasselheim. The good guys and the bad guys are very much skittish and on edge. All that to say, they agree to head to the seminary. FCG basically finds Vitro Asham's office, and like we've seen in previous episodes, Vitro is immediately enamored with FCG and is like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Brings FCG in. Turns out he does know Joe from Bosros, and begins to tell FCG a little bit about his backstory, and says, you are a harmonious heir Morton from Aor, and that the technology is gone. There's no way to create any more of them, but he is a diplomatic person. He's a creature of peace. To which FCG says, oh, I'm really surprised. I thought maybe I was like a Trojan horse kind of murder bot. And Vitra says basically that it could be possible. There was a time period called the Care and the Culling where it wouldn't be uncommon for a Aormaton to be gifted as a gift, and it turns out it's a crazy murderer. So definitely says there's something to that. Before chaining FCG up, lifting him up, and basically opening him up and tinkering around on his insides. He does mention something, arcane, oh man, what was it called? Like an arcane regulator or arcane accumulator is what it was called. And basically says like, yeah, it's a little damaged. Unclear if this is related to FCG going off edge and going crazy. But basically says that he can tweak it, work on it, fix it, but says it's going to need constant maintenance, and also mentions that it is so powerful it could explode the entire building that they're in. Just a casual note. In addition to this, Vitro basically says like, hey, how can I get in touch with you in the future? And FGG is like, should I say Lord Esteros, even though he's dead? Like thinking about like where to send like a letter, and finally says the Spire by Fire is a great place to reach out to him. Beyond that, FGG does ask for some modifications and says, hey, is there a way that I could open up my stomach and bake something like an oven, which is an interesting nod to a supposed feat that he possibly picked up, the chef feat. So it seems like we have some confirmation of that. Moving on from there, we have Imogen and Fern who make their way to Khadijah Sumal's office. They knock on it. The person's like, oh, I'm busy, is pretty much refusing to open the door until Imogen basically says, hey, I'm trying to find out more about my mom. I think you know something about the Ruidusborn. We hear 7 locks unlock. This person has barricaded themselves in their office. And Sumal basically gives them the scoop on their study from years ago and confirms that Liliana was a participant in the study who came with an enormous amount of questions. Also mentions that Otahan Thule was a participant of the study, though notably Otahan already knew of the Omen archive and began being somewhat questioning of the whole process, which really made them all very skittish and actually caused them to end the study. They also studied these people called the Exaltants, which we know is Imogen and Otahan as well as Liliana. These extremely connected people to Ruidus, and how these people, when they were, quote, very connected, would have dreams like we've seen with Imogen, where the Raylora would show up. These entities of the dream that would sometimes be friendly, would sometimes be sad, empathetic, and sometimes very aggressive and angry. All that to say, moving on from that conversation, they begin to ask even more about Imogen's mom. And Sumal basically says, yeah, in fact, I have that last session I had with Ileana, and let me read it to you. And begins to read that last journal article when suddenly the locks open up, all 7 of them. The door opens, and an older elven man with silver hair enters the room. Will, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, so that's where we go to break, and we pick back up with Fern basically standing now looking at this gentleman that has come through the door.
Pure Fern.
Yeah, and they quickly recognize it to be Ludinus Deleth. So Fern is kind of standing between Ludinus and the rest of the room, but more importantly, Professor Sumal. And so Fern tries to distract him, basically being like, hey, we're having girl talk right now. Like, we're having tea. Like, come back just a little while. Like, we'll be done. And keeps trying to, like, kind of bar his entrance, saying things like that. Ludinus isn't having it. And after Fern's, like, second or third time of saying something like that to him, he actually casts a spell on her. And Matt calls for Ashley to make a wisdom saving throw. She actually gets, I believe, a 26, so she succeeds whatever he was trying to do. And Ludinus, thinks like, oh, well, that's cute, and he kind of still just shoves past her anyway. And he then officially introduces himself as the Martinet Ludinus Deleth of the Cerberus Assembly. And he walks up to Professor Sumal and tells her that you've been avoiding the assembly's requests for weeks now. He then like snaps his fingers or waves his arm. I forget like what exactly. It's not
Yeah.
important. And basically casts arcane lock on the door, and it slams shut. Um, he says, those files should have been sent to me by now. And she says like,
Belongs
oh,
in a museum. Sorry.
she says, that's Travis, by the way, the voice of Reno. Fun fact. He basically, or she says, oh, we sent everything your way. Like, you should have it. And then Ludinus casts another spell and basically immediately charms her. And she becomes essentially just like a robot or a puppet and, obliges his every will. And once he does that, she reaches below the desk, brings out the papers that she was just, talking to Imogen and Fern about, and hands them to Ludinus. He then, puts them in his coat and turns to Imogen and remarks that, Sumal is right. You do look just like your mother. And he says he's heard of her prowess. And then he takes a look at Fern and comments that, oh, you're not quite an exultant, but you too are Ruidus born. And then he asks what their business with Professor Sumal was. And Imogen just says, I was looking for my mother. And Ludinus says, well, I know your mother, so if you have any questions, I might be able to answer them for you. And he says he's extremely grateful for Liliana and all that she's done, and that Imogen would be, or should be, proud. Imogen then asks, well, how can we help you? She's trying to fish for more information, obviously not being genuine and wanting to help him. And Ludinus asks if she feels the pull northward. And Imogen actually confirms with Matt that she does feel this, but she does indeed. She feels like this slight pull to the north. And he says, follow your instincts, the both of you, if it's there. And he says, other than that, if you want to help, just stop resisting. Then Fern asks if he's Ruidus born, and he answers it vaguely. He says, I have my connections to the Red Moon. So Imogen then asks, does it speak to you directly? And he says, I've had conversations. He then asks if they know what they're doing. And Imogen says, we know we've picked up bits and pieces. And she again tries to kind of play into this facade to try to, I guess gain his trust. And she says like, the power is so enticing. And his response to that is, power is just a tool to, get what you want done. And so she asks, if you guys succeed, will the power go away? And he says parts of it will for those that cheated through unearned boons. The society was born on those who gained power through transactions, unearned except through obsession to gods. He says, we never needed the gods need us. And Fern's like, well, so what's on those papers you just took? And Ludinus says, I don't want to spoil the surprise. She kind of asks again and kind of pesters him about it. And he leans in and says that he watched the world burn at the gods' requests, destruction brought down to stunt mortal minds. And he says that if there's even an ounce of faith in you of the gods, you have no place in our ranks. And then they're like, how old is he? And he says, old enough. So he then turns to leave and kind of undoes the arcane lock and says, kind of gives his one last little stinger. That is, we are the seed they plant and till and water. They returned to private gardens because they were told there was no alternative. But all children outgrow their parents. The divergence wasn't meant to protect the mortals. It was to protect the gods. He then strolls out of the room. And meanwhile, Professor Sumal is still just sitting there with a smile on her face, having been charmed, but like a single tear is rolling down her cheek. So Imogen and Fern immediately like transition to like trying to help her. They're like, how can we snap her out of this? How do we help? We then cut back to Orem. Orem, I believe it's Orem, Ashton, and Chetney, I think is the other group. And Orem actually sees Ludinus leaving, and so he immediately knows something is up, and he's like, we need to go check on the others. Meanwhile, at the same time, FCG and Laudna are finishing up with Vitro Asham, who has finished FCG's Easy Bake Oven, and they thank him and head off to meet with everybody else, where they run into Orem and the rest of the crew, and they actually see Carol, who is like the employee they saw a couple episodes ago, and they're like, hey, we need to be let in, and they basically intimidate her into letting them in. So then all the rest of them are running up to catch up With Fern and Imogen, they ultimately do, whilst Imogen and Fern are still trying to help Sumal. They ultimately land on we got to tell Plane Rider Rin. They can't figure out any other way here. So they message her, tell her what's up. She immediately teleports or apparates to them. They fill her in on the Ludinus situation and what just happened. And there's a lot of discussion here, but ultimately the party lands back where they were, is that like we got to do something about one of these devices. And so Rin is like, Feywild or Shadowfell, like pick your poison. Um, and they ultimately decide to go to the Feywild to speak to Fern's grandma. Rin says she will take care of Sumal, and she will also take care of their Ruby Vanguard prisoner that Pate is currently watching. And once that happens, Marisha summons, or Ludna summons Pate back to her. And then Rin begins to teleport them to the Feywild. She says, where do you need to go? It's like an imperfect magic, but I can at least get you close. And Fern says the destination is the Harrowcall Fens, specifically the Ligament Manor. So Rin casts a spell. Bells Hells usher inside, and they basically go through and fall on this like soft, spongy soil in this dark land. It's like creepy, magical marsh. And Matt describes there's all these like gnarled trees, and they're essentially creating like this enclosed canopy above them. You can't tell where one starts and the other ends, but it's almost like a dome of tree branches. Immediately the party notices that Fern looks different. She still looks like Fern, but her features are sharper, her ears longer, her limbs like elongated, and they're kind of like, it's kind of scary, but Laudna's like, I'm about it.
Yeah.
So as they go, they're like, Fern, which way do we go? She thinks she knows. And as they're traveling, there's a moment here where there's these flowers that pop up. And Laudna is kind of interested in them and is kind of like singing and goes and like kind of like tickles one basically. And the flower seems to like it. And when she does that, it like changes colors. And then all these other flowers start popping up and they seemingly like want attention as well. Laudna doesn't really know what to do. So she kind of like runs by and high fives them. And suddenly they all like withdraw at once. And when this happens, they can hear trees start to like uproot and move, and they realize that this like canopy of trees is enclosing in on them, almost like a cage. The flowers slowly start to emerge again and like kind of sway expectantly. And Fern, they're like, Fern, can you talk to them or something? And so Fern tries to talk to them, and they're like, do you have speak with plants? And she's like, no. So I think she still rolls like a really high persuasion check or something, and she's like, we're just trying to get to Nana's. And the flowers keep moving, and they ultimately realize that they're kind of reacting to music. So Fern gets out her pan flute, and Imogen actually begins to sing, and the flowers start to like sway with the rhythm. And as that's happening, the cage slowly opens and is giving them a path to escape. So they get out, and once they're about like 40 feet away, all of the flowers suddenly screech at once and then disappear. And it's a great jump scare for like the whole table. Anyway, now that they're out of that, Fern has like fully picked up the scent of her grandmother's place and starts running to it. It's this massive tree in the middle of this like dome-like glade. And Matt describes this like equally like awesome and amazing yet horrific tree structure with like these different bits and baubles and empty nests all strewn within it. Fern makes her way to it, and these vines like kind of open up like a canopy to let her in, and she just goes in and immediately starts like ascending up the tree, the party close behind her. They reach partway up the tree where it splits into like two different trunks, and there's like this landing area with furniture and stuff. And that's when we first hear a voice of Morrigan welcoming them, being like, oh, Fern, it's so good to see you. Not what she sounds like at all, but I'm not even going to attempt to emulate that. She's like, oh, here, meet my friends. It's like, you guys need a cocktail. And they're like, yeah, absolutely. She's like, okay, well, follow me. We'll get it. And then another voice says like, welcome. And Fern's grandma like opens up her robe to reveal there's like another mouth on her stomach that has a distinct voice. And that's basically where the episode ends. So yeah, that was episode 45, Ominous Lectures.
So yeah, let us know if you want to see the whole episode discussion and you're watching just the recap. You can check the link below, but and let us know what you thought about the episode. Will, Reactions.